Colleagues, welcome to our joint webinar today on lessons learned from the higher education sector response to the invasion of Ukraine, which UUKI is delighted to host in partnership with Halpin. My name is Jamie Arrowsmith. I am Director of Universities UK International. Just before we start, I will note that the session is being recorded today as well for colleagues that aren't able to join us. I just want to help to set the scene before I hand over to Susie and colleagues from Halpin, who will talk us through the report. But as many will know, the UK university community responded to the invasion of Ukraine with a huge outpouring of support and goodwill, and really practical support as well. And I think what that really demonstrated was that universities really can play a vital role in responding to humanitarian crises. I think this is something we all knew, but this was a real demonstration of that. And indeed, I think that kind of the response that we've seen to the invasion really showed what was possible when the policy, the funding, and the political environment and interests really aligned with the goodwill, the creativity, and the commitment of colleagues across the UK's higher education community. The very broad range and spectrum of responses that we saw, which involved bringing together funders, regulators, government agencies, and universities, but also with both private sector and charitable organisations, really has meant that the UK's response to supporting the higher education community in Ukraine has been really significant and really impactful. And I think that is absolutely something to be celebrated. However, I think the scale and that impact that we've had of our response has rightly posed questions for us as a sector over how we as a community and collectively can respond to and support other higher education systems that are experiencing humanitarian or other forms of crisis. Now, the genesis of this project was therefore to really take the opportunity to reflect on the work that we've undertaken as a sector to support the higher education community and academics and students in Ukraine through things like the UK-Ukraine Twinning Initiative, but also broader than that, and really look at what lessons we can draw for the future. Now, we all know that global challenges are becoming ever more acute. We need only look at the news over the past week to see evidence of that. And that geopolitical relationships are increasingly fraught and contested. So I think the need for university systems across the world, or from universities across the world, to help navigate those challenges is only going to continue to grow. And I think that partnership with and support from systems such as the UK can hopefully play an invaluable role in helping them to navigate those challenges. But there are also very real limits on what any single institution or even a whole community can do. And so I think it's really incumbent on us as a university sector across the UK to think carefully about how we can respond in a coordinated, strategic and appropriate way to different crises and challenges as they emerge. And this is where the report comes in. So I hope that colleagues have had a chance to have a look over the report and they can, along with today's session, play a key role in stimulating discussion and debate over what we can do as universities, as a higher education community, to help respond to humanitarian crises, both now and in the future. So I'll end there. And so it's with pleasure that I introduce our partners in this project, Susie Hills, the project director of this report and joint CEO and founder of Halpin Partnership. So Susie, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. And thank you everyone for joining us today. As Jamie's explained, this webinar will explore the report that's just come out this week. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to the report authors, Dr. Paula Sanderson and Emily Owen from Halpin, but they're going to run through the report findings with you. There's going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end, so please feel free to write your questions in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation and we'll ask as many questions as we can. Before we get started, I wanted to thank everyone who's contributed to the report via interviews, case studies and through the focus groups. We really appreciate your involvement in this project. And I'd like to offer particular thanks to our Ukrainian colleagues who generously volunteered their insight during what's quite an awful time. Thank you to all of you who are joining us today. And with no further ado, I'll hand over to Paula and Emily.
Thanks, Susie. I think we're coming to me first. Apologies. So, yeah, the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 prompted what we are describing as an unprecedented response from the UK higher education sector, its funders, but also its partners. We think that it's the first of this scale from the sector. Over a year into the invasion, these initial humanitarian responses are now transitioning into long-term mutual partnerships. But we did want to stress that the report was written 1 year into the invasion, and clearly some of the case studies that we talked to were in the very early stages of development. There's so much more rich contribution coming from partners that we just wanted to position that. The report's a result of 5 months of desk-based research, of numerous semi-structured interviews with universities, with partners, with funders, very broad interviews, with a number of focus groups to which colleagues will have contributed, and most importantly with Ukrainian colleagues who contributed, we know, at a time when things were incredibly challenging, and gave us really rich and supportive feedback, for which we're really grateful. The research was guided through a number of lines of inquiries. The first, ensuring that we had a comprehensive review, that we were understanding the breadth of response from the sector and partners. I think it's really important to contextualise that. You're going to see in the full report, and we really encourage you to use these slides in conjunction with the full report, some really rich case studies. They're not too lengthy, they're easy to understand, but they show really the breadth of response. But in terms of the comprehensive review, to some extent, has to be contextualised around when the research was undertaken. We wanted to clarify successful outcomes, so we wanted to think about, the background, key conversations and key decisions that applied, and what resulted in the current schemes, including our understanding of the hopes and aspirations from different stakeholder perspectives. A really key element, and you'll see even the phraseology of the report, is around lessons learned. So we want to learn from our experiences and use those as we look forward. What were the challenges and what were the blockers to successful support? We wanted to understand the conditions for success, so to have a real focus on those enabling factors that had they not been in place would have prevented the type of response that we saw. And then we wanted to look ahead and to ensure opportunities to build on for the sector. So ultimately we came to, in fact, 8 lessons learned, of which 1 we have already taken forward and were talked to in the seminar. So that's that framework response piece. 7 of which are directed at individual universities, the sector and policymakers, and then this final lessons learned around a framework response, which we'll talk to in more detail, but which is where we really would love the contribution of colleagues. I'm going to hand immediately over to Emily, who's going to start to take us through each of those lessons learned.
Thanks, Paula. So the first 2 lessons we have to share with you today, we have categorised as general lessons. This is because we hope they are lessons that will resonate and that everybody can relate to, no matter where they sit in a crisis response. So whether that's individuals working in teams at an institutional level, right up to policymakers that are making these decisions that allow these responses to take place effectively and efficiently. So our first lesson is that we recommend responses should always be locally led. We think it's fitting that this is our first lesson because it's something we hope people will consider in those early days of decision making around intervening in a humanitarian crisis. What we mean by this is that responses should always be driven by that local context that we are dealing with, and hopefully directed by those people that are most impacted, in as far as it is possible to do so. You will see, if you do reflect on the full report, and we absolutely encourage you to do that, that one of our kind of overarching conclusions is that in a crisis response, accountability should always be to those affected people. And this is something that we are trying to drive through lesson 1 here. For a university, for example, this might mean, instead of asking in those early days, what should we do, where should we support, it's going to those impacted communities and asking, what do you need from us? Now, of course, this isn't about placing the burden on those impacted people who will undoubtedly be going through a really challenging and difficult time, but allowing UK institutions and the partners working closely with them to have that role of being a facilitator and an enabler of what we hope will be an even more effective response. When we say locally led and locally situated, the first association that may come to mind is thinking about the country or the community that is most closely impacted by a crisis. But in our research, we hope people will also consider the local context in terms of the higher education institutions that we may be working with. For example, the Ukrainian Catholic University, who kindly and generously shared a case study with us for the report, were quite unique in their situation. So at the time that we spoke to them, they were not under direct military threat. They are situated relatively close to the Polish border. In comparison to their colleagues over in the east of Ukraine, then, they had different priorities, and these were around developing human capital, building capacity, and developing intellectual potential that they know will be core to reconstruction efforts. Of course, these priorities will look very different for a university where there may be an immediate threat to infrastructure, or indeed an immediate threat to life. Our second lesson then, which is also a general lesson that we hope everybody can take something away from today, and indeed going forwards, is our recommendation that our response should always be delivered in partnership. So you'll see again an overarching conclusion of our full report is that the response to Ukraine has so far been so effective because it has been sustainable, it's been locally situated, as we've just seen, and it has been coordinated, where different actors and stakeholders across the sector have come together to work in partnership and in unity. So when we refer to this coordinated and connected response, we really mean bringing together knowledge, understanding, expertise, and key relationships. This might be knowledge of a particular higher education system in another country, or knowledge of a specific political situation. It might be an understanding of a particular culture, for example, that we may be working in when we're responding to a crisis. And key relationships prove to be a great enabler in the response to Ukraine. The example at the top of my mind are those incredible relationships nurtured by Cormac Consultancy Group, both before and during the conception of the amazing twinning programme. And if you read the full report, you'll see a similarly brilliant case study contributed by Bath Spa University that reflects on some of those relationships they already had with the Ukrainian sector. When we talk about this comprehensive and integrated structure of support, we also limit any kind of risks around duplication of effort. It means responses aren't ad hoc or piecemeal, but everybody is working together under the same mission and towards the same purpose. And having said this, all of the partners and networks that have come together in this response means we now have a new group of emerging sector leaders and experts who may have had very little or no crisis response experience, but had that willingness to help in the early days of the crisis. And they now have experiences and expertise for us to draw upon in future. And we want to really celebrate this throughout our research. So I'm going to hand back to Paula now, who's going to take us through the next couple of lessons learned.
So it seems fairly obvious to say that the policy environment, particularly in relation to visa regulation and access to student finance for Ukrainian students, was a key enabler. It was an absolute differentiator, which enabled a really different response to that which we have seen in other humanitarian or human natural disasters. If I think of Iran, Turkey, Morocco, Syria, Jamie talked about some of the news today. There are some really challenging questions that come to us with the research. So, why was this response so different? Questions around proximity, questions around people like us. We haven't attempted to provide a solution to those, but it's clear they hung heavy throughout the research, and there is a real need to consider our roles and our collective influence in the policy and regulation space, particularly given the drive for reparations of our colonial past in the quite rightly it at the forefront at the moment. I think keeping HE in the conversation with organisations like the FCDO and DSIT is a really key recommendation of the research, and we went as far as looking towards a standing committee with government departments and sector representatives coming together. It in fact links to one of the later recommendations where we talk about the need to develop a comprehensive understanding of the strength, expertise, and have a mapping exercise for the sector that enables us to be a really core part of that conversation. So also seemingly in some ways relatively obvious, but the availability of funding for the sector was key to the rapid and coordinated response. Funding is particularly critical at the moment, and we heard from lots of UK universities around concerns around financial resilience and how they were able to contribute given the financial concerns around the financial health of the sector. One particular tension for twinning, for example, was the need to commit to a 3-year partnership whilst funding for universities is renewed annually, and most of us are acutely looking at a 1-year budget setting frame. I don't think that was about a lack of wanting to contribute those finances towards Ukraine. It was about wanting to commit really responsibly and concerns around letting Ukrainian colleagues down if people were not able to continue to commit. I think looking ahead, one of the recommendations is moving from the concept of funding to the concept of financing. That will be particularly relevant as Ukraine moves from emerges from war, we hope quite soon, into rebuilding its infrastructure and supporting its people. So a move from funding to financing, also a key finding. There was a bit of attention around measuring the impact of funding. So the nature of support meant that there had, the ability to have very quick financing funding in place meant there had been very little upfront conversation about what measurements of success might look like in terms of that funding. And whilst it's really difficult to conceive that we would think about KPIs in such a situation, there is still a need to demonstrate due diligence over public money. And so attention between the funders perhaps and us demonstrating how we had used that funding, but also the knowledge that unless we could really clearly demonstrate the impact, the likelihood of ongoing funding could be a risk. So I'm going to hand back to Emily to go through the next 2 recommendations.
Thanks, Paula. So our next 2 lessons learned are really directed towards UK institutions. So first and foremost, this is universities. We've spoken to many universities across the sector and individuals in various roles with various responsibilities in responding to the crisis so far. But indeed, these may be relevant to some of the bodies and partners working closely with universities as well. So lesson 5 is our recommendation that all crisis responses should be underpinned by strong and effective governance. This really refers to ownership, accountability and responsibility at an institutional level over the effectiveness of that response. For example, this may take the form of buy-in from senior stakeholders in the university, whether that's vice-chancellors, executive team members, or indeed crisis response teams that may well come out of the response that we're talking about today. This could be, for example, the ability to fast-track ordinary decision-making processes. We know that time really is of the essence when we're responding to a crisis. It might be the implementation of new policies that we didn't think we'd need to use before, like a safeguarding policy that is tailored towards refugee experience individuals. But really, it's about making sure that advocates and champions within an institution directing that response are fully resourced and fully supported in doing so. We also know that as much as universities have shown an incredible willingness to help and support this response, there is unfortunately only so much that one university, one organisation, or indeed one sector can do. So because of this, we also suggest that a response should be supported by a business case, a business plan, and risk assessed within the university's standard procedures. And really, this helps teams to establish those parameters of possible action. It means that when we know what we can do, we're focusing on that instead of where the boundaries are and what maybe we can't do. Having said that, that's really where the partnership piece comes in again, because we may be working within our own boundaries or parameters, but we may be able to draw in expertise, knowledge, or resource from other bodies. For example, this might be the Council for At-Risk Academics. Another element of governance is ensuring that responses are within the charitable objects of the university, so a key part of that governance framework in a crisis response. We saw throughout our findings and our research some tension between what is considered to be aid and what is considered to be fulfilling the educational purpose that is at the core of our UK universities. We do see guidance from various areas like the Charities Commission, the Office for Students, and the general consensus is that if an activity is advancing education, if it's furthering education and research, then it is happening appropriately. But there are understandably questions posed and challenges around this. And we hope you'll see that when we talk about the framework in a little while, there are some questions that we'd encourage people to ask of themselves to understand the if, how, and when around responding appropriately. Our next lesson then, also directed at UK institutions, is lesson 6. And this is where we recommend that individuals or organisations should always be undertaking a thorough environmental analysis of the crisis situation that they are dealing with. This is really all about understanding the unique situation, the complexities, any technicalities that we may need to be aware of. For example, there may be political elements, there may be religious elements, there may be environmental elements, and the more knowledge that we are equipped with, the more efficient and the more effective our response can be. As part of this, we also suggest there needs to be a strong understanding of the higher education system in which we may be offering our support. So this was considered to be a great enabler in responding to Ukraine. Many people highlighted similarities between the UK and Ukrainian higher education system. Of course, there are significant differences too, but when we say this, we mean, for example, that Ukraine works within the Bologna process. They have that 3-stage qualification model of bachelor's, master's and doctorate level education that we're familiar with here in the UK. And that proved to be a great enabler, but one that we might not have a similar grasp of when we're responding to other communities or other countries. Another element to this lesson, and one that is perhaps more challenging and sensitive, is looking at our own values as a university or as an organisation. So there may be, for example, a need to address challenges relating to differing perspectives on equalities or other human rights concerns. For example, these may relate to gender or sexual orientation. So it's here that we suggest teams need to step back, reflect on those values that drive their day-to-day activities, and use these to decide and understand where their response can be most appropriate. And I'll hand back to Paula now to take us through those final lessons learned.
Apologies for the slight lag, colleagues. It's taking a time for me to be able to take back control of the slides. Lesson 7, and for me, you know, one of the really key recommendations of the report is that we develop a sector-wide competencies map or similar phrase that really leaves an enduring and lasting view on our teaching and our research capacity, capability and resources. So I feel that in the case of Ukraine, we could have been more agile, we could have sought out knowledge and expertise and experience within our collective capacity and capabilities more rapidly. But I also think this firmly puts us into the conversation around humanitarian response in the future. So throughout the research, we had incredibly rich conversations, and we started to develop an understanding of some of the expertise that sat across the sector, some of the incredible work to teach students through development studies, but also some of the related research activities that we feel, if were readily available, would be a really comprehensive tool for the future. I think there was a real need to make sure that we really do have the right knowledge, experience and expertise before we step in. And I think this would also be a valuable tool to ensure that we were best placed to respond. Emily talked about some of the incredible partnership work that we have that we evidenced, and actually Emily talked in relation to governance, but I actually think there were some incredible examples where we're drawn on greater expertise and experience from our partners than we necessarily had within our own institutions, and it was the power of that partnership really that led to some of the really richest case studies that we saw, and some that we just touched upon in the early stages of development and we know will come through as incredible case studies as we look ahead. So then moving to lessons learned 8. And this is one that we're going to talk to in more detail, but the development of a framework for the sector. We've already talked about how coordinated, how rapidly we came together. We think we would do that more effectively if we had worked using a humanitarian framework. To create our humanitarian framework, our higher education humanitarian framework, we did an awful lot of review, investigation, research into existing standards. So we look, for example, at the Sphere standards, at the core humanitarian standard, at the Do No Harm framework. And they revealed some really important reflections for us. So the first being around power imbalance. And the potential for those providing the humanitarian response to make decisions and to take actions that didn't fully reflect the needs of those impacted. It goes back to that, lessons learned number 1, that that any response be locally led, not locally informed, locally led. And I think that's a really key differentiator. There's a very powerful reflection for me around that connected and rapid response. And how we were celebrating that as through the research, and actually talking to one colleague in Ukraine who said, it's not that I didn't want your help, it's that bullets were flying past the windows and I needed to have my staff safe, my students safe. So I wanted your help, just not then. And I think it's that real need for us to think about that power imbalance. And that plays out in many different ways, in many different situations. The framework's pointed to an overemphasis on short-term relief over, the longer-term needs, and I think that comes through very clearly in the research as well. If you look at some of the case studies, the lack of coordination is one of the key elements of frameworks, and I think we did incredibly well in coordinating. I think UK and other colleagues really supported that coordination, but actually, some of the lovely partnership examples that came through in our narratives were even stronger. So, I remember talking to the Welsh sector who had said it was by happenstance that we discovered that a group of Welsh universities, geographically co-located, were working with a group of Ukrainian universities, actually geographically located, and we found that we could group together, that we didn't need to duplicate some effort, so specifically in terms of physical infrastructure being moved, for example, but actually beyond that. And so those groupings and that, the thoughts around some of those connections became really evident. and potential for, I guess, even greater coordination as we learn from the work. We built into the framework questions over access and security, so very, very obvious and evident, just in terms of travel, etc., in a situation of war, but as relevant in other humanitarian situations. And then this need for accountability and transparency, and we've already talked to that in terms of financing, funding, the need to think about accountability to those who are providing and funding any of our responses. So it's those reflections, along with the research, that really shaped the creation of the higher education humanitarian framework. So in the development of the framework, this is really a recap. So the three overriding principles that we took into the framework, that accountability to affected people, that deep listening, that deep understanding of what people need at any one moment, the pivotal role of policy and the regulatory environment as underpinning the strength and scale of any of our responses. It seemed obvious to us to be saying policy, regulation and money were really key. However, they really were the differentiator between this response and our ability to respond in other situations. And then this incredible role that partnership has played as being core to our coordinated response. And Emily talked about the parameters of our objectives as universities and the need for those things to be rested in our articles of governance, and that we were definitely moving into the space of aid in many situations. And actually one of the ways in which that was addressed was through partnerships. So where we'd moved into aid space, we could actually partner to create an even stronger response. There was a beautiful example which didn't make the case studies, it was too early in development, around, it was Cardiff Metropolitan University, who had brought together botanical gardens, I think in Edinburgh, certainly in the UK, with a partner in Ukraine whose greenhouses and huge collection of botanical samples were being damaged, for example. So we'd acted as a catalyst, an enabler in partnership. So that became really key in our thinking about the development of the framework. And this is it. This is our framework. So Emily is going to shortly take us through each of the 5 core elements, but you'll see very, very centrally situated in the framework is that coordinated, networked and partnership approach. Everything coming through as being locally situated, that locally led piece of the framework, the importance of policy and regulatory as the regulatory environment as an underpinning element that enables or distracts from our response. But then really the importance in the sector of looking to the resources, skills, experience that we already have. So we have teaching and we have research and knowledge exchange as kind of holding up the entire framework, and it was really important to us that those were two-way interactions. So not only that our research and knowledge exchange work and our teaching was contributing to the humanitarian response that we could give, but also that we were actively learning and taking back into our teaching and our research environment the lessons that we'd learned from really understanding and using a cyclical approach to a response. I am going to hand back to Emily to talk through each of the elements of the framework.
Thanks, Paul. So to begin with, we just want to introduce you to a kind of another element of this framework, really. So as you've seen there, Paula has explained we've had 5 distinct phases that we believe should take place in a cyclical manner. And because we really want this to be a tool that can be used practically, that people can use it in a tangible way and revisit it as a crisis unfolds and continues, we've decided to pose 5 sets of questions that map onto or indeed align with each of those 5 distinct phases of the response. So really these questions help an organisation or an individual team, or indeed the sector at large, to articulate the kind of so what question behind responding to a crisis, and even that initial should we respond at all that may take place in the early days of a crisis unfolding. Again, those three key findings of the research, those principles that Paula has already spoken through, have really helped us to devise these questions, and hopefully you'll see that these are concepts very much alive in the questions that we pose. So we really encourage you to take a look at our full report, as it's here that you will find the full question set. And we would really encourage you to reflect on those and how you might decide to use them if you were to use the framework yourselves. But for the purposes of today, we've given a kind of idea of some of the areas that those questions cover. So to begin with phase one, our comprehensive environmental analysis, we suggest in our report that your typical PESEL analysis tool can be used to help users in working through this first phase. We do also add an extra piece of analysis to this tool, another E, which represents education. And this is here to encourage users to think about the higher education system and the specific unique nature of that system that they need to be aware of when they are responding to a crisis. In addition to this, some of the questions reflect on the purpose of that intervention. Is this going to be short-term relief, financial relief, for example? Or is it something that we imagine will develop into a longer-term partnership, perhaps a research partnership or the exchange of a joint teaching programme? We also think about collective objectives here and success measurement. As Paula has touched upon, we don't imagine that measuring success in times of crisis is always appropriate or easy, but we need to be ensuring that accountability to affected people. And it's only through understanding the impacts that we're having that we can assure this. And then we also cover delivery intentions in our questions. For example, are we planning to withdraw support at any point? Or is this something that is going to be part of our day-to-day activities? Is it going to become part of a strategy, for example? Phase two then sits with preparedness and capacity building. And this is something that we believe anybody using the framework should spend a significant amount of time reflecting on. So some of the questions we pose here relate to, for example, resources and constraints around them. We have touched upon in our report that current picture of a higher education in the UK that Paula spoke about earlier. And I'm sure for a lot of people on this call today, financial constraints are possibly something that comes to mind. So this is really about understanding where those parameters of possibility lie, working out what we can do and understanding where we might need to place limits on and boundaries on that response. Coming out of our environmental analysis then, we will now have a deeper understanding of the social and cultural environment that we are working in. So do we need to adapt to this? Do we need flexibilities in any way? Or do we need to approach certain conversations with any sensitivities in mind? And of course, we're really emphasising that having knowledge and understanding of the higher education sector and the system in the affected country is going to be a real enabler to an effective response. In phase three, then, we're thinking about that initial, but also the ongoing assessment of capability and needs. And really, we want to emphasise that cycle here. We're constantly going back, revisiting the framework and reflecting on our learning. For example, our questions refer to expertise and knowledge. Do we have the right people in the room? Do we have the right people around the table making decisions that can represent, for example, the legal framework we're working in, a political situation that we're working in? And beyond this, are we also optimising those amazing collective capabilities that we see in our universities? Are we going to the students' union, for example, and asking them to set up a peer-to-peer mentoring mechanism, or even organising a fundraising drive, any of those kinds of activities. And then really importantly, are we constantly reflecting on the changing nature of the disaster? Unfortunately, we are now way over a year into the invasion of Ukraine that happened in February 2022. And we know that the situation for universities will look very differently now to how it did in those first few months. So are we revisiting our purpose and our objectives? Are they still relevant? And are we still being accountable to affected people? For phase 4, then, our questions pose questions around resource assessment, allocation and mobilisation. This might be physical resources, for example, the laboratory space that we have available for our research at risk fellows to use. Are there constraints around this? For example, many people we spoke to shared their frustrations with the so-called phase 2 of the Homes for Ukraine scheme, where they had accommodation buildings, for example, that they hoped to use to host students on scholarships, potentially their families and dependents, but they did not have the policy in place to allow them to do this. So is policy keeping track of what we want to do as well? And last but not least, we have phase 5. So as we've mentioned, our framework suggests that this response is very much cyclical. Each phase is very much embedded as one kind of model and one framework. But phase 5 is perhaps slightly more distinct in that it has a longer term outlook, and that is ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So this is something that may take place once momentum has built and activities are underway, and we might be starting to see evidence of some of the impacts of our interventions at this point. So this is about revisiting our ongoing purpose of the intervention. Do we need to withdraw our support at any point? Do we need to change the methods by which we are giving support? Can we measure the impacts of our delivery at this point? As we've mentioned today, very difficult to measure any form of success in times of crisis for obvious reasons. But can we now introduce any early performance indicators or metrics that help to tell us what's going on and paint a picture of the impacts that we're having? And of course, this links directly to that really, really important message that we always need to be ensuring and maintaining accountability to those people that are most impacted. So I'll hand back to Paula now to talk through some of our final reflections.
So yeah, thank you, Emily. So really, it comes to me just to think about looking ahead. One of the limitations of our research was the ability to talk deeply to a large number of Ukrainian colleagues. We held focus groups and we had individual one-on-ones, but just the very nature of the situation that they were in meant that some of those interactions were limited, some of them were cut short. Some of the environments in which we found ourselves interviewing colleagues were really very, very challenging. Ukraine remains, in war, and the need to kind of think about the impact and the outcome and to keep gathering case studies that we can learn from feels really important as we look ahead. You can tell I'm deeply passionate about the idea of bringing together this idea of what our capabilities, expertise, resources are in the sector, of bringing them into conversations with government, with policymakers, and being ready to deploy and move in the right way with the right skills, the right expertise, is something that I think is really important that we develop as a sector. Making sure that our university executive boards, in whatever, however we phrase that, and our boards understand our role, our place, and what the limits of our engagement might be. So we hope that the framework itself is picked up, is used and is developed. Take it, make it more applicable, more relevant. I know that we feel that these frameworks are best adapted through use and in practice. So that's a real passion as we look forward. But I'm going to head back to Susie, if that's all right. I think, Susie, I will hand back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Emily, and thank you to all of you for asking questions. We'll run through those as quickly as we can. I wanted just to apologise because I understand some of you had problems with the link at the start. Sorry if you weren't able to, if you join us straight away and you missed a couple of minutes. A recording will come round to you all with the slide set so you can catch up on anything that you missed. So the first question that was posed to us is what motivated Halpin to be involved in this project? And perhaps I'll answer that while Emily and Paula gather a breath, and just say that Halpin is a higher education management consultancy firm. We're dedicated to the sector, and we're always interested in projects which take the sector forward in some way. And for us, we were passionate that this was one of those projects that could help take the sector forward. So we're always looking for those kind of research projects. Another one of our projects you might want to check out is Living Black at University, where it explored the experience of Black students in university accommodation, for example. So we're always looking for this type of project, and we're grateful that Universities UK International decided to work with us on this project. So the first question I'm going to pose, I think, is going to be for Emily. Both Diana and Ben were interested in what was surprising. Were there any unexpected or unintended outcomes? Was there anything that we came across that we found particularly surprising during our research? Emily?
Oh, surprises. I think there were many aspects to this research that surprised and were very memorable for both Paula and myself. Some of those things that came to mind are when we spoke to Ukrainian colleagues. We had some very profound conversations. We had quite emotional elements to this research, and that's something that Paula and I are reflecting on currently. But I think one of the surprises for me happened probably in the early days of this research. And that's when we reached out to the sector. We asked for people to get involved. We held interviews with lots of people across UK universities, and they told incredible stories of people just being willing to help out and to be involved in this response. So, of course, these are people that had their day-to-day roles to be getting on with. They had responsibilities elsewhere. They had high workloads to be dealing with. But they had that goodwill to get stuck in and really step up at a time that they knew their colleagues over in Ukraine needed them. So perhaps not surprising in that we know how incredible the sector is when it comes together, but amazing to hear these stories coming out of people really stepping up and doing the right thing. So I think that was a surprise for me.
That's great, thank you. And we've got a question about using the higher education humanitarian framework. And unfortunately, as we've seen, there's been a number of humanitarian crises and environmental crises that have been hitting various communities. So the question that is being posed is, how can the framework be quickly utilised by UK higher education institutions in the short term to deal with some of these immediate crises? Perhaps if there's key components that can be considered in the short term. So, Paula.
Yeah, yes, and I think the framework, like all frameworks, is can be used at multiple different levels. For me, I think the environmental scan, so the use of that pestle with the extra E piece, is the obvious place to start. So just doing a really strong scan to understand what the political environment we're working in, what some of the constraints are or not of the policy and regulatory environment. Through the research, we also, you gather other rich data as you research questions, but we heard about individual university responses to, for example, Afghanistan, where people had acted and then not been able to fulfill fulfill their ambitions because of the policy and regulatory environment. So I think being really clear of the environment in which you're working in and making it that a really comprehensive evaluation is the bit that I would pick up first in the framework. The framework itself, it will take time to work through, certainly to bring in the education, the research to think about what those elements mean. So that really strong understanding of the context, both the context in which disaster, war is happening, other humanitarian crisis responses are needed, and then the UK sector position or your institutional position as well. So that's the bit I think that people can start using very rapidly.
Thank you. Rob's asked if in a future humanitarian crisis, do you think there'd be value in HEIs collaborating together, perhaps regional group meetings or mission group responses?
Yeah, Emily, shall I go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 100%, 100%. I think, you know, genuinely as I reflect on my time in HE, it is the only time that I can evidence that we've come together completely collectively, completely focused on one endeavour where individual agendas were put aside, and replicating that, whether that be at the whole sector with its partner levels or you know, or a regional level. I think about, you know, the focus group I really think about, and there was a question around the devolved nations. You know, I think about the focus group with the Welsh sector and how powerfully they had come together to take beyond twinning, beyond working with the incredible partners that we work with, you know, Cara, etc. They took that beyond, they worked together, they collaborated, they came up with local solutions to work and to not replicate resources, but to multiply the impact of the work that they were doing. So I think that's, you know, really key.
Great, thank you. And perhaps, Emily, we've had a couple of questions which are around how do we hope that the sector will use and build upon this research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the immediate place my mind goes to with this is probably around using that framework. So as Paula has mentioned, we hope the framework is something that people can adapt and make relevant to their own situations and their own processes. But I think the framework is first and foremost one of the key takeaways that we want people involved in crisis responses in the future, and indeed reflecting on responses so far to Ukraine, to really use and revisit and use as a practical tool. On top of this, I think case studies are going to be really important going forwards. So we do recommend in our report that a repository of case studies is built over the following months, year, whatever the time frame might be, so that we can see the transition of some of these initial responses, especially in the partnership space. So many interesting stories coming out of twinning partnerships. And I think it would be a shame if we left them here. I think it would be really great if we could see the trajectories that those partnerships are taking and how that might be a blueprint for us to act in the future and adapt the schemes we've seen coming out of this crisis to make them relevant to those elsewhere. So I think the framework and building that repository of case studies are really important for me. And I do want to say at this point as well, we think that sector competencies mapping exercise is also going to be a really important part of this, and probably the one thing that we would encourage the sector to take forwards if possible. It would be great to know where the resources and expertise lies and where those amazing pockets of examples across the sector can be drawn upon in the future.
That's great, thank you. And one of the questions was about the mechanism by which UUK International and us at Halpin can collect feedback from HEIs and other stakeholders on the use of the humanitarian framework, and whether you've got any suggestions of the kind of next steps in terms of collecting feedback. Perhaps Paula.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that's probably, in fairness, a follow-up piece of research. So I think it's such a detailed exercise. I mean, I think there's mechanisms we can put in place, but we haven't yet got, you know, that fully framed how we would take that research forward. We do have the humanitarian group that's been established, and I know they're doing a really good job of thinking about some of those elements, but maybe that repository, really important, I think, to talk to organisations like UKRI about what's been funded, to think about the FCDO and how we interact with them around need. So I think there's probably a follow-up piece of research that needs to be undertaken there.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a similar question around sharing data and comparative analysis of other countries on the same topic. And I think that probably falls into the further research category as well, does it?
I think it probably does. You know, some care over the data that we exercised, much of that data was gathered in confidence. So whilst we have the general qualitative and quantitative outputs, I think that we'd be happy to share. Clearly, there were some really personal insights in the data collection, and so the data itself not. But I do think the responses and, you know, using potentially even using the PESEL as a way of building up a narrative around the strengths and weaknesses in the sector and what individual institutions can and cannot do in that space and within their realm would be incredibly powerful within the next step.
That's great, thank you. I think we've covered off most of the questions that we've been posed to us. You've mentioned the question around devolved nations. Was there anything else from the case studies that you would particularly point people to that you found particularly valuable or inspiring?
So one thing I did, it's not necessarily about the case study, it's about focus groups, but when we were talking to our Ukrainian colleagues in a room, there were two really profound things for me. One, we know that we're talking to women because men are on the front line, but actually when you take a moment and you're in that space and you realise that there are incredible women stepping into roles to try and, you know, that they haven't worked in to shape and drive and care, and that their partners are not with them. But also that in that environment, what we found is one university was talking about a challenge and another university from Ukraine in that space said, I can help you and I'm only here. And what we saw was in the focus groups, care and support and actual direct action being taken as a result of the focus groups. And that's really, really stuck with me. So not particularly, slightly digressing from your question, but those two things have really stayed with me.
Thank you. And Emily, anything that you would point people to in terms of the case studies?
Yeah, I think we certainly have a really broad and interesting range of case studies. So I would, of course, encourage people to take a look at all of them. But I think especially the case study, which is from King's College London, is particularly interesting. So we really emphasised today that idea of partnership working, how the sector might build for the future. And it's in that case study that King's describe how they want the work they've done and the programmes they've developed to be of use to the whole sector. And they're now working in a consortium of a few other universities. So it's a really great way to exemplify that partnership piece of strengths coming together and people being willing to share some of those ideas and impacts that they're having. So this isn't something that people want to keep to themselves. They want to share it with their colleagues across the sector. And I think that's really important.
Wonderful, thank you. And perhaps that's a good note for us to bring this webinar to a close on, and to thank everyone again who participated in the research and gave so generously their time, and particularly again to our Ukrainian colleagues who gave their time generously in such a difficult situation. And for all, and congratulations to everybody for all the work that they've done in this area.